Lena Vasquez had a rule. Never take photos of strangers. She broke it once, just once, and it cost her everything she thought she knew about the life she'd built. It was a Tuesday in October, the kind of cold that came early and stayed personal. She was shooting the waterfront for a freelance editorial. Old piers, rust, light hitting the water sideways. The kind of job that paid just enough to keep her from calling her mother back in Tucson and admitting she'd made a mistake coming to Chicago. She wasn't supposed to be at that end of the dock. She was framing a shot of a rusted crane when a man walked into the edge of her viewfinder. She almost lowered the camera. Almost, but the light caught him in a way she hadn't planned. The angle, the fog, the strange stillness of a man standing at the end of a pier like he was deciding something. Her finger pressed the shutter before her brain gave permission. One frame. She didn't think about it again. She forgot about the photo entirely until the man showed up at her apartment door 3 days later. He didn't knock loudly. That was the first thing that unsettled her. The knock was almost polite, measured, like someone who knew she was already home and was simply giving her the courtesy of opening the door herself. She checked the peephole. 2 men she didn't recognize. One broad and still as furniture. The other leaning slightly against the wall, arms crossed, face turned just enough that she couldn't read his expression. She opened the door because she lived on the 4th floor and both her deadbolts were locked, and she told herself that meant something. It didn't. Lena Marsh, the larger one said. Not a question. That's me. She kept her hand on the edge of the door. Can I help you? Mr. Voss would like to speak with you. She didn't know anyone named Voss. She said so. The man with his arms crossed finally looked at her directly. His eyes were a flat, unremarkable gray, and they moved over her face with the detached efficiency of someone cataloging an object. You have a photograph, he said. Mr. Voss would like it removed. She thought about the waterfront, the accidental frame, the man in the fog. I didn't publish it anywhere, she said. It was editorial work, and the series didn't run. Mr. Voss is aware. A pause. He would still like to speak with you. She should have said no. Every reasonable part of her brain was already composing the refusal, but the man at the end of the pier had looked like he was deciding something, and she had always been stupidly curious about the things people decided when they thought no one was watching. Fine, she said. Where? The building was in the West Loop, glass and concrete, and the kind of quiet that expensive lobbies manufactured. No signage on the directory that meant anything to her. The elevator required a key card she wasn't given. The broad man pressed his own and stood slightly in front of her for the entire ride up, which she understood was not for her comfort but to block her view of which floor he selected. 30-something, maybe 40, high. The office she was brought to wasn't what she expected. She had mentally prepared for something aggressive. Dark wood, the territorial arrangement of a man who needed his desk between himself and everyone else. Instead it was spare. Almost empty, a long table, 2 chairs, windows floor to ceiling overlooking the river. The man from the photograph was standing at the window. He was taller than she'd registered through the viewfinder, broader through the shoulders. He was wearing a dark suit with no tie, jacket buttoned, and he didn't turn around when she entered, which told her he'd heard her but was choosing the moment himself. She didn't speak first. She wasn't sure why. It wasn't strategy, exactly. More that she didn't know what she was apologizing for yet. You're a photographer, he said finally. Still facing the window. Yes, freelance. For now. He turned then, and she understood, in the blunt way you understand things that don't come with instructions, that this was a man who had spent a long time deciding how much of himself to show in any given room. Not much. He showed not much. Zane Voss, he said. She didn't extend her hand. He didn't either. The photo, she said. I told your people. It wasn't published. I don't even know if I kept the file. It was an accident. I know. He moved toward the table but didn't sit. I'm not here about the photo. She waited. I'm here because of what's in the background. She hadn't looked at the photo closely. She'd scrolled past it in her edit, marked it accidental, moved on. She tried now to remember. The pier, the fog, the crane at the edge of frame. And behind him, visible only because of the angle, 2 men at the far end of the dock, one of them handing something to the other. Oh, I see, she said, because she did see, and pretending otherwise felt dangerous. Zane Voss watched her arrive at the conclusion. His expression didn't change. You understand why this is a problem, he said. I'm not a journalist. I'm not interested in whatever that was. What you're interested in, he said quietly, is less relevant to me than what you saw. She felt the shift in the room. Not a threat, nothing as obvious as that. More like a door closing softly behind her. What do you want, she asked. He looked at her for a long moment. Long enough that she stopped trying to read his face and started paying attention to the quality of his attention instead. He was thinking, actually thinking, not performing deliberation, not stalling, computing. I want to know if there are other photographs, he said. From that morning. Other frames. I can check my camera roll. I'd like you to do that here. She pulled out her phone, scrolled back to that Tuesday, showed him the series. 14 frames, 11 of the crane in the water, 2 of a gull that had landed on a piling, 1 of him. Only 1 of him. He looked at the screen for a moment, then back at her. And your camera? At home, I shoot digital. The cards are backed up to a cloud drive. Show me the drive. She didn't like that. Something in her chest went tight and resistant the way it did when people assumed access. That's my work, she said. That's client files. I understand. His voice was flat, not cruel, not apologetic. Flat, the way ice is flat when it's thick enough to bear weight. And I'm asking you to trust that I'm not interested in your client files. I'm interested in a single morning in October. You're asking me to trust you, she said slowly. In a building where no one outside knows I am after your men showed up at my apartment. Something moved across his face. It was small and fast, and she almost missed it. That's fair, he said. She hadn't expected that. She showed him the drive. He found the folder, confirmed the single image, and handed her phone back. His hands, she noticed, were careful. He gave it back like it was hers. I'll need the file deleted, he said. I'll need confirmation. You could have just asked me that at my apartment? I could have. He didn't explain why he hadn't, but she was starting to understand that Zane Voss made decisions on his own timeline and with his own reasoning, and that he rarely felt the need to narrate either. She deleted the file, emptied the trash, showed him the empty folder. Thank you, he said. She stood. Are we done? Yes. She was almost at the door when he spoke again. You're good, he said. The photograph was good. Even as an accident, she didn't turn around. I know. She heard something that might have been the beginning of a sound. Not quite a laugh, not quite an exhale. She left before she could decide. She thought that was the end of it. She was wrong, but not in the way she'd feared. There was no follow-up visit, no sense of being watched, no dark car idling outside her building. She went back to work. Shot a restaurant opening in Wicker Park, a portrait series for a nonprofit in Pilsen. 3 days of product work she hated because the rate was too good to refuse. She also thought, more than she would admit, about the moment his face had shifted when she'd called him on the situation. That's fair, 2 words. From a man who clearly did not make a habit of finding things fair. She didn't understand why she kept returning to it. 6 weeks later, her camera equipment was stolen out of her car. Not unusual for Chicago. Terrible, expensive, catastrophic for someone whose gear was both her livelihood, and the last thing she'd bought before her financial margin went to zero. She filed a report. She called her insurance. She sat on her apartment floor for 20 minutes, doing the math that kept coming out wrong, and then she called her best friend Darcy, who lived in Logan Square and was the only person who could hear her cry without making her feel worse about it. You need to call your mom, Darcy said. I'm not calling my mom, Avlena, Darcy. A pause. Okay, what else do you have? She had a Nikon body with a cracked screen that she'd been meaning to have repaired for 2 years. She had a 50mm lens that needed calibration. She had 3 jobs booked in the next month that required equipment she no longer owned. She had, sitting in a drawer because she hadn't known what to do with it, a business card, Zane Voss, a phone number, nothing else. She held it for a long time. She told herself she wasn't going to use it. She was absolutely not going to call a man she'd met once under uncertain circumstances because her camera bag had been stolen and she needed money. She texted him instead, which felt marginally less dramatic. This is Lena Marsh, the photographer. I have a proposal if you're open to it. The reply came in 4 minutes. I'm listening. She didn't pitch it well. She knew that walking in, she was not a person who pitched things. She was a person who showed up and did excellent work and hoped the work spoke loudly enough. But she laid it out as clearly as she could. She needed to earn back the cost of her equipment. She had skills that might be useful to someone in his position, and she was not interested in asking for charity or a loan. What skills, he said. Not a question, a prompt. I'm good at going unnoticed, she said. I'm good at documentation. I notice what other people don't pay attention to. That's what made the waterfront photo. I wasn't watching you. I was watching the light. And I still caught what I caught. He looked at her the way he had the first time. Like he was running a calculation. You want to work for me. I want to work. Temporarily. Until I can replace my equipment. After that we're done and you never have to think about me again. What makes you think I've thought about you at all? She met his eyes. Because you kept the card for 6 weeks and you answered in 4 minutes. The calculation behind his expression ran a little longer this time. 2 months, he said finally. Documentation work, nothing that crosses a legal line, mine or yours. You'll be given specific assignments. You won't ask questions about context you're not given. And the rate? He named a number. She kept her face still because she'd practiced. Agreed, she said. You're not going to negotiate. You named a fair number. I don't negotiate fair. That small movement crossed his face again. Faster this time. She was starting to be able to track it. It happened when she said something he hadn't anticipated. Monday, he said, 9 o'clock. The work was documentation as promised. Corporate surveillance of the legal and specific kind. Photographing meetings she wasn't introduced at, capturing faces and exchanges and the body language of rooms she slipped through without speaking. She was good at this. She had always been good at disappearing into the corner of a space and watching. What she was less good at was Zane Voss himself. He was precise. Everything around him moved with a specificity she found both impressive and exhausting. The way tasks were delegated, the way rooms were arranged before he arrived, the way people near him spoke in complete sentences and never repeated themselves. She understood, watching him work, that this was not a man who inherited his position. He had built it, deliberately, out of some earlier version of himself that she couldn't quite picture. He didn't speak to her beyond the requirements of each assignment. She didn't expect him to. But she noticed that he noticed her. The way his eyes moved to her location in a room, the way you locate an exit, automatic and without much thought. She didn't know what to do with that either. The assignment that changed things happened in week 5. She was documenting a property meeting. 6 men around a table, a negotiation over a warehouse district on the south side that had been running for months. She was in the corner with a long lens, invisible, when one of the men at the table looked at her directly. Not the way people accidentally glanced at cameras. He looked at her the way you look at something you've already identified. She kept shooting. She didn't adjust her expression, but something in her chest went cold and careful, and after the meeting ended she found Zane alone in the corridor. "The man on the left side of the table," she said. "Third seat from the door. He knew I was there." Zane went still. "Before you arrived," she said. "He was already looking for me." "You're certain?" "I'm certain." He looked at her for a long moment, then passed her down the corridor toward the room where the men were still filing out. His jaw set in a way she hadn't seen before. Not anger, exactly. Something more contained than anger. Anger processed through a very long history of knowing how to manage it. "You'll go home," he said. "I'll have someone with you tonight." "I don't need Lena." First time he'd used only her first name. It stopped her mid-sentence. "This isn't about what you need. It's about what I'm not willing to risk." She didn't argue, not because she couldn't. She could argue, she was excellent at arguing, but because the way he said it didn't sound like authority. It sounded like something else entirely. She went home. There was a car outside. She didn't wave at the men in it. She sat in her apartment that night and looked at the photographs from the meeting on her laptop screen, zooming into the face of the third man from the door. He was 50s, heavy, with a watchful quality that even still photography couldn't flatten. She forwarded the file to the number Zane had given her for work correspondence. He replied at 11:30. "How did you see that?" She thought about the way she'd noticed a man in fog because the light told her to. "I was watching the room, not the meeting," she wrote back. A long pause. Then, "That's the difference." She stared at that for a while. She put her phone down. She picked it up again. The difference between what? Between people who see and people who look. She didn't sleep much that night. Not because of the car outside, though that didn't help. Because of a message from a man who had handed her phone back like it was hers, and named a fair number without negotiating, and said that's fair when she'd called him out. And she was beginning to understand that Zane Voss was not the version of himself that the room assumed. 3 days later, one of the men from the South Side meeting followed her home. She made him on Michigan Avenue. Gray jacket, unhurried pace, the particular quality of someone who wasn't trying to close distance, just maintain it. She walked into a coffee shop, sat with her back to a wall, ordered something she didn't drink, and texted Zane without drama. "I have a tail. Michigan and Erie. Gray jacket. I see him. Don't move." She sat very still. She watched the gray jacket stop across the street, take out his phone. She watched. 11 minutes later, 2 men materialized from directions she hadn't tracked and walked toward him with the practiced calm of people who did this regularly. The gray jacket left. Zane came into the coffee shop 8 minutes after that. He sat down across from her without asking if the chair was taken. She looked at him. "You were already nearby." "Yes. Why?" He looked at the untouched coffee in front of her. He looked at her hands, which were on the table and perfectly still, which she suspected he noticed because he noticed most things. "Because I had a feeling," he said, "that it wouldn't stop at one incident. You should have told me. I know." There was that phrase again, adjusted. "I know" instead of "that's fair," but with the same quality, the acknowledgement without defense. She was starting to recognize it as a pattern. This man did not apologize performatively. He simply absorbed the correction and incorporated it. "What does this mean for the arrangement?" she asked. "It means," he said slowly, "that you're not just a contractor anymore." She waited. "It means that people associated with me are now people who can be used against me. And I don't." He stopped, restarted. "I don't bring people into that accidentally." "You didn't bring me anywhere," she said. I came in with a business card and a broken camera, Lena. Second time with her first name. I looked up your work before you texted me. I had your file before your gear was stolen. I was going to reach out. She sat with that for a moment. You were going to offer me a job. Yes. Before any of this happened. Yes. She thought about the photograph. The accident. The light hitting him sideways while he was deciding something at the end of a pier, unaware that she was there or that any of this would follow. Why? She asked. He looked at her across the small table in a coffee shop on Michigan Avenue on a Thursday afternoon, and for once his expression didn't run the calculation first. Because you see the room, he said, and because you handed your phone over when I asked, and you didn't make me feel like a threat for asking. And because when I gave you a fair number, you recognized it. I haven't had a person in my orbit in a long time who operated from that kind of. He paused, searching. Clarity. She didn't speak for a moment. That's a very careful way to say something, she said finally. I'm a careful person. I know. She picked up her coffee. It was cold. She drank it anyway. So what now? Now, he said, I'd like you to stay. Not as a contractor. Not on a 2-month arrangement. I'd like you to be. Another pause. Longer this time. She was beginning to understand that the pauses were where he was being honest, not evasive. Close, she said. That's the only word I have right now. She put down the cup. I have conditions, she said. I expected you would. I keep my own apartment. I keep my own clients. I don't disappear into your world. I move through it on my own terms, agreed. And if I ever feel like I'm a piece on a board and not a person, I walk. He looked at her steadily. I will tell you, he said, if that's ever in danger of happening. You have my word. She studied him. She thought about what she knew of him, which was not much, still not much, but what she had was specific. The pier, the card. That's fair. I know I was going to reach out the way he gave things back. Okay, she said. Okay. Neither of them moved for a moment. The coffee's terrible here, she said. I know. I own the building. I'll speak to the tenant. She laughed. She hadn't meant to. It came out sharp and genuine and surprised her, and she watched something happen in his face. Not the small flicker she'd been cataloging, but something wider and slower, like a window opening in a room that hadn't had air in a long time. The months that followed were not easy. She hadn't expected them to be. She wasn't a person who expected ease, but the particular difficulty was one she hadn't fully prepared for. Not the danger, which was real and present in the form of the ongoing South Side situation and the men connected to it. Not the strangeness of moving through a world that operated outside the rules she'd understood. The difficulty was Zane himself. He was not a man who was used to being known. She understood this the way you understand a structural feature of a building. Not because anyone told you, but because of the way the space arranged itself around it. He had built his walls before she arrived, and most of them were load-bearing, and she didn't have any interest in demolition. But she had always been good at finding the door. It happened in pieces. The Tuesday he asked her what she was shooting on a personal project, and then looked at the images for longer than was professionally necessary. The night the South Side situation escalated, and he sat in his office at 2 in the morning, and she stayed, not because he asked, but because she didn't leave, and he looked at her at 3:15, with an expression that had no calculation in it at all. You don't have to be here, he said. I know. He looked at her for another moment. Thank you. Not that's fair. Not I know. Thank you. Direct, unhedged. She understood it cost him something. Tell me about before, she said, not the work. Before. He was quiet for a long time. Then he told her about his father, who had built the first version of this empire from nothing and ruled it with a closed fist, and who had believed that needing people was a liability that could be exploited. He told her about the years he'd spent learning the operation from the inside while his father was alive, and what it had cost him in the kind of things you couldn't put on a ledger. He told her about the last relationship he'd had, which had ended the way things ended in this world, not from cruelty, but from a woman who eventually understood the shape of what she'd be sharing him with and chose not to. I understood it, he said. I didn't blame her. The pause. I stopped trying after that. You think wanting someone is a liability, she said. He looked at her sideways. I think I used to. She let that sit. I'm not going to make you promises you can't hold me to, she said. But I'm also not built for the other thing. I'm not good at halfway. I know, he said quietly. You're going to have to decide what you're willing to risk. He looked at her, really looked at her, the way she looked at rooms, taking in the whole of it rather than the specific point. I already have, he said. I decided the day you walked into this office and showed me an empty folder without making me feel like a threat. She held that. You're very strange, she said. I've been told. I mean it as a compliment. I know, he said. And then, after a moment, with something in his voice she hadn't heard before, something that sounded like relief. I know you do. Darcy met him in February over dinner at a place in the West Loop that Lena had specifically chosen because it was not one of his buildings. Darcy was small and relentless and had opinions about everything at high volume, and Lena watched, with a pleasure she kept to herself, as Zane navigated her the way he navigated every room, carefully, attentively asking the questions that mattered. He actually listens, Darcy said afterward, pulling Lena aside while he'd handled the coats. Like, he looks at you when you're talking, not past you. I know, Lena said. That's rare, I know. Darcy looked at her with the particular expression of someone who had known her for 12 years. You're in it, I know, Lena said for the third time. And then, because she was honest and Darcy deserved honesty, I've been in it since the coffee shop. Which coffee shop? There have been several coffee shops, Michigan Avenue, in October. Darcy looked at her. That was 4 months ago. I'm aware. You've been in it for 4 months and you're only telling me now. Darcy glanced back toward the front of the restaurant where Zane was accepting their coats from the check attendant with the same quiet attention he gave everything. And, he is, Lena said. He has been, he just took a while to say it out loud. Darcy nodded slowly. Okay. A pause. He's terrifying, by the way. I know, and you're completely fine with that. I'm fine with him, Lena said. That's different. The South Side situation resolved the way things in Zane's world resolved. Not with a single moment, but with a series of quiet decisions that Lena was not fully briefed on and did not fully ask about. The man who had followed her on Michigan Avenue was not a problem again. The man from the meeting with the 2 knowing eyes appeared in a news report 6 weeks later, connected to a securities investigation that had nothing to do with Zane Voss and everything to do with choices that man had made well before October. Lena kept her apartment until March. She gave it up because she wanted to, and because she told Zane the distinction mattered to her. And he said he understood the distinction. He wasn't entirely wrong that his place was larger. She refused to let him say that. Don't, she said. I wasn't going to. You were thinking it. I'm always thinking several things, he said. That doesn't mean I was going to say it. She looked at him. He looked at her. I'll keep the lease on the studio space, she said. I need a room that's mine, done, and you're not buying the building. A pause. Zane. The thought occurred to me. Don't. It would be practical. It would be you trying to wrap something around me that I didn't ask for. He went quiet. The calculation ran. Then, you're right, I won't. She studied him. He meant it. She could tell by now the difference between the things he said because they were expedient and the things he said because they were true. This was true. Thank you, she said. He looked at her with that window-open expression she'd first seen in the coffee shop. You don't have to thank me for not doing something I shouldn't do. I know, she said. I'm thanking you for getting it. He moved toward her across the kitchen of the apartment that was now theirs, and she held her ground, which she always did, and when he reached her he put his hands on either side of her face with the same carefulness he gave everything. Like she was hers, not his, and he was just grateful she was here. I've been getting it for a while, he said quietly. I just needed someone who could see the room. She looked at him. She thought about a pier in October, fog on the water, a man at the end of a dock deciding something while the light came in sideways. She thought she finally understood what he'd been deciding.